On August 2nd, 1939, a letter was signed that would redirect the course of human history. It was not written by a general. It was not written by a senator. It was not written by a banker or a politician. It was written by a physicist, a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, working in a rented cottage on Long Island. The letter was addressed to the President of the United States, and most people alive today have no idea that the theological principle at the heart of that letter was borrowed directly from a 2,000-year-old Talmudic ruling about when it is permitted and required to break every rule in order to save a life. My name is Rabbi Solomon. I have spent 30 years at the intersection of Torah law and capital strategy, and I am here to tell you that the Einstein letter was not just a scientific document. It was a business decision. It was an emergency capital deployment based on a Talmudic principle that most people have never heard of, executed under extreme time pressure with incomplete information, and it changed the world. Let me show you exactly what happened, and then let me show you what that same principle looks like when you apply it to your business today. Here is what almost no one knows about the letter that started the Manhattan Project. Albert Einstein did not write it alone. The primary drafter was Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jewish physicist who had already patented the nuclear chain reaction concept in 1934, and who understood, more clearly than anyone alive, what the Nazis were working on. Szilard was the one who drove out to Einstein's cottage on Long Island in July 1939 because he needed Einstein's name, not Einstein's ideas, Einstein's name. Because Szilard understood that in a crisis, the right signature on a document is worth more than the most brilliant argument in the room. That is Talmudic thinking. That is leveraging relational capital at the precise moment it counts. Einstein signed. The letter was dated August 2nd, 1939. It was addressed to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Here is the central argument of that letter, stripped down to its core. Germany is pursuing uranium research. The physics is already known. A nuclear weapon of extraordinary destructive force is theoretically achievable. If Germany builds one first, the consequences for Western civilization are catastrophic and irreversible. Therefore, the United States must begin its own uranium research program immediately, and the federal government must find the resources to fund it. That is the entire argument, and it is, in structure, a perfect Talmudic Pikuach Nefesh ruling, Pikuach Nefesh, Tractate Yoma 85a to b, the saving of a life. The Talmud teaches, and this is not a metaphor, this is a legal ruling that Jewish courts have enforced for 2,000 years, that the preservation of human life overrides almost every other commandment. You may violate Shabbat to save a life. You may eat non-kosher food to save a life. Right now, your money is exposed. Inflation, market crashes, economic collapse. Most people lose everything when it hits. Jewish billionaire families never do. For 3,000 years, they've used one Torah system to protect and multiply wealth through every crisis. That system is now in one book. Link in the description and first pinned comment. You may spend money you do not have, break contracts you have signed, suspend normal operations, and take actions that would otherwise be forbidden. All of it permitted, all of it required when a life is at stake. Yoma 85a to b is not a spiritual suggestion. It is a legal framework. And Szilard and Einstein, both Jewish, both shaped by that tradition, even if neither was orthodox, built their entire argument on that foundation. The threat is existential. The response must be existential. Normal rules do not apply. Do you understand what I am telling you? The letter that launched the Manhattan Project was a Pikuach Nefesh brief. It was a formal argument that existing rules, congressional approval, normal procurement channels, peacetime budgeting protocols were insufficient for the threat being described. It was a request for extraordinary executive authority to allocate capital outside the normal framework because the survival of civilization was at stake. and Roosevelt listened. But here is the part of the story that kills me every time I tell it. Alexander Sachs was the man who hand-delivered that letter to Roosevelt in October 1939. Why October? Because Roosevelt was busy. Because it took 2 months to get a meeting. Sachs was an economist, a friend of Roosevelt's, a Jewish intellectual who moved in the highest circles of American power. He understood that walking into the Oval Office with a letter from Einstein and saying the Nazis are building a nuclear weapon was going to be a short conversation unless it was framed correctly. Sachs did not lead with the physics. He led with Napoleon. He told Roosevelt the story of how Napoleon had dismissed Robert Fulton's proposal for a steam-powered navy and how that decision had cost France its dominance of the seas. He was saying, "Do not be Napoleon. Do not miss the technological inflection point that changes everything." And then he handed over the letter. Roosevelt read it. He turned to his aide and said, "This requires action." And then he did something that will make every businessman in this room either laugh or cry, depending on your temperament. He allocated $6,000. $6,000 for the initial uranium research committee. $6,000 to respond to an existential threat. That was Roosevelt's first move. Now, before you dismiss this, I need you to understand that $6,000 in 1939 was not nothing. It was a real commitment, but it was laughably small against the scale of what Szilard and Einstein were describing. And Roosevelt knew it. He was not being stingy. He was being cautious. He was allocating the minimum viable resource to keep the option alive while he assessed the situation. Every deal you've ever lost, every salary you didn't get, every contract that fell apart, happened because you didn't have this. For 3,000 years, Jewish billionaires have negotiated with 12 Talmud tactics that nobody taught you. I put every single one in one book, the Talmud Negotiation Bible. Link in the description and first pinned comment. Get it now. This is also Talmudic thinking. The Talmud does not tell you to spend everything on every emergency. It tells you to respond to the emergency, to begin, to move. Deuteronomy 4:9 says, "Guard your soul carefully," not bankrupt yourself immediately. Guard carefully, respond with precision. $6,000 was Roosevelt's guard carefully. It kept the program alive while larger forces were assessed. The Advisory Committee on Uranium met. The S-1 committee was formed. And then, after Pearl Harbor, after the full emergency was undeniable, Roosevelt went to the other extreme. He authorized the Manhattan Project in its full form. By the time the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the program had cost approximately $2 billion. In today's money, roughly $30 billion. The largest single government-funded scientific project in human history at that time. Funded largely through executive discretion, hidden from most of Congress, because the security requirements made normal appropriations channels impossible. From $6,000 to $2 billion. From a meeting in October 1939 to Trinity in July 1945. From a letter signed on Long Island to a changed world. That is what Pikuach Nefesh looks like when you take it seriously. Now let me bring in the other Talmudic text that sits underneath all of this, because I think it is the more important one for what I want to tell you today. Sanhedrin 4:5, the Mishnah. Whoever destroys one soul, Scripture accounts it as if he had destroyed an entire world. And whoever saves one soul, Scripture accounts it as if he had saved an entire world. This passage is not just a moral statement, it is a legal principle with profound practical implications. If saving one life is equivalent to saving the world, then the calculus of cost-benefit analysis changes completely. You cannot say, saving this one person costs too much relative to the budgetary impact on the organization. If the life is real and the threat is real, the cost is always justified. Szilard understood this. He knew that if the Nazis developed nuclear weapons first, the scale of destruction was not one life or one city. It was civilization level. And under Sanhedrin 4:5, that justified extraordinary action. Here is my question for you. When is the last time you applied this standard to your business? Not every threat to your business is existential. Most operational problems are not pikuach nefesh situations. Your accounting software failing is not an existential threat. A bad quarter is not an existential threat. Losing a key employee is not an existential threat. These are serious, and they require serious responses. But they do not require suspending the normal rules. But some threats are existential. Some threats require the Manhattan Project response. And the tragedy I see, over and over, in businesses run by intelligent, disciplined people, is that they apply normal budget thinking to existential threats. They allocate $6,000 to a $2 billion problem, not because they are stupid, because they have not been trained to distinguish between ordinary operational challenges and genuine existential crises. The Torah forces you to make that distinction. Pikuach nefesh is not a blanket permission to spend freely on every problem. It is a demand that you correctly identify the category of the threat. Is this a life or death situation? Yes or no? If yes, the normal rules do not apply and you must act. If no, the normal rules do apply and you must be disciplined. Einstein and Szilard answered that question correctly in 1939. The Nazis had the physics, the materials, and the scientific talent. The threat was real. The category was existential. The response had to match. Let me show you what this looks like in a modern business context. I have a friend. I will not use his name, but he will know who he is if he ever sees this, who built a distribution company over 20 years. Solid business, 8 figures in annual revenue, good margins, loyal customers, strong relationships with suppliers. In 2017, one of the large e-commerce platforms changed its logistics algorithm. Overnight, his largest customer, representing about 35% of his revenue, gained the ability to fulfill orders directly from the platform's own warehouse network, cutting my friend out entirely. The customer did not leave immediately, but my friend saw what was coming. He could read the trajectory. This was a pikuach nefesh moment. The survival of the business was at stake. Not in 6 months, not immediately today. But the direction was clear, and the terminal point was clear. He did not do what most business people do in this situation, which is to optimize operations, reduce costs, and hope the problem resolves itself. He did the pikuach nefesh thing. He suspended his normal capital allocation rules. He took on debt he would normally never take on. He acquired a smaller competitor who had relationships with a different set of customers. He invested in warehouse technology that gave him capabilities the platform could not replicate. He moved aggressively, expensively, and fast, because he understood that the threat was existential and the normal rules no longer applied. 2 years later, the revenue he had lost from the original customer had been replaced by 3 new customers with better margins. The debt was paid off. The business was stronger than it had been before the crisis. He did not know he was acting on Talmudic principles. He had never read Tractate Yoma in his life, but he had the instinct for it. He correctly identified the category, existential threat, and he responded with the proportional level of resource deployment that the situation required. That is, pikuach nefesh in a boardroom. Here is the deeper principle I want you to take from the Einstein letter, and this one is harder. The letter was addressed to Roosevelt, but Roosevelt did not act on it for 2 months, and when he finally acted, he allocated $6,000. The full response, the Manhattan Project, did not begin until 1942. 3 years after the letter was written. 3 years. In 3 years, Einstein and Szilard could have given up. They could have concluded that the warning had been delivered and the government had failed to act, and that was the end of it. They did not. Szilard in particular kept pushing. He continued to write, to lobby, to make the case. He was persistent in a way that looks, from the outside, like stubbornness or obsession, but it was neither. It was Talmudic persistence. The Talmud does not tell you that once you have identified a pikuach nefesh situation, you make one attempt and accept whatever response you receive. It tells you that if the life is at stake, you do not stop. You continue until the life is saved, or until the possibility of saving it is exhausted. Szilard did not exhaust the possibility. He kept going, and eventually, the resources materialized. This is the part of emergency capital deployment that most business owners get wrong. They correctly identify the existential threat. They correctly understand that normal rules do not apply. They make their case once, or twice, or 3 times, to a board, to investors, to a partner, to a bank, and when the initial response is insufficient, they retreat to ordinary operations and wait for the threat to materialize. That is not pikuach nefesh. That is performing pikuach nefesh and stopping before the job is done. And the Talmud is very clear. Stopping before the job is done is not a virtue. It is a failure. If the threat is real and you have correctly identified it as existential, your obligation is to continue pressing until the response matches the threat. Not aggressively, not desperately, with the same calm, methodical precision that Szilard used when he drafted those letters. But you do not stop. Deuteronomy 4:9 again, guard your soul carefully, carefully, with attention, with persistence, not with a single warning and then resignation. Now let me tell you what Einstein himself said about money, because this is relevant. Einstein was famously indifferent to personal wealth. He gave away most of his prize money. He lived simply. He was not a businessman, but he understood, at a structural level, something that most business people do not fully grasp, that capital, deployed at the right moment on the right problem, has exponential leverage. $6,000, positioned correctly in 1939, eventually became the Manhattan Project. The leverage ratio was extraordinary, nearly 1,000,000 to 1 in nominal terms, but the leverage was not arbitrary. It came from the precision of the initial placement. The $6,000 did not fund a bomb. It funded the question. It funded the advisory committee on uranium's first meeting, their first experiments, their first assessment of whether the physics was real. And because the physics was real, and because the committee confirmed it, the $6,000 unlocked access to the next layer of resources, and the next, and the next. This is the Torah principle of Hatshara, preparation. You do not need to have all the resources at the beginning. You need to have enough resources to answer the first question correctly. And if the answer to that first question confirms the threat, the subsequent resources will follow, if you have done the work of positioning yourself to receive them. Roosevelt's $6,000 was Hatshara. It was the minimum viable investment to confirm the hypothesis. Once confirmed, the resources scaled to match the threat. Ask yourself, what is the minimum viable investment you need to confirm your hypothesis about the threat your business is facing? Not the full Manhattan Project budget, the $6,000 question, the first committee meeting, the first experiment, the first answer. Because once you have that answer, everything else follows from it. Let me close with what I think is the most important thing about the Einstein-Szilard letter that nobody talks about. The letter worked not because Einstein was famous, although that helped. It worked not because the physics was correct, although that was necessary. It worked because the letter made a specific, bounded, falsifiable claim. Germany is pursuing uranium research and has the theoretical foundation to build a weapon. And it proposed a specific, bounded, minimum viable response. The United States should convene a committee, establish relationships with uranium suppliers, and accelerate its own research. It did not ask Roosevelt to fund the bomb. It asked Roosevelt to take one step, to move from 0 to 1, to open the file. That is Talmudic precision. The Talmud does not deal in abstractions when it comes to legal obligations. It deals in specific, bounded actions. You must do this thing in this situation within this time frame, not generally move towards saving a life. Specifically, take this action now. Szilard understood that asking Roosevelt to fund a nuclear weapons program in 1939 would have resulted in zero. He asked for the minimum viable action that kept the door open, and that was enough. When you identify a pikuach nefesh situation in your business, an existential threat that requires emergency capital deployment and the suspension of normal rules, do not make the mistake of asking for everything at once. Make the letter to Roosevelt move. Ask for the minimum viable action that keeps the door open. Get that commitment. Then let the confirmed reality of the threat do the rest of the work for you. $6,000, then $2 billion. That is how it works. Here is what I want you to take from today. First, pikuach nefesh is a legal framework, not a spiritual metaphor. It requires you to correctly identify whether a threat is existential or operational. If it is existential, normal rules do not apply. If it is operational, they do. Most people never make this distinction explicitly, and they pay for it. Second, the Sanhedrin 4-5 principle that saving one life equals saving a world changes the cost-benefit calculation completely. When the stakes are existential, cost is not the primary variable. Probability of survival is the primary variable. Capital serves survival, not the other way around. Third, the Einstein-Szilard approach to emergency capital deployment was precise, bounded, and persistent. Not dramatic, not desperate, specific and relentless. Make the minimum viable ask that confirms the hypothesis. Let the confirmed hypothesis unlock the resources. Fourth, Deuteronomy 4:9. Guard your soul carefully means that once you have identified the threat, your obligation does not end with the first warning. You continue until the response matches the situation. These are not management consulting ideas. They are not startup frameworks. They are 2,000-year-old legal rulings from one of the most thoroughly tested bodies of practical ethics in human history. And they work. Next week, I'm going to begin a new series of Torah money laws, drawn from the deeper layers of the Talmud, from contracts that have never been published in any business book, and from the private correspondence of the wealthiest Jewish families in modern history. The Torah is not just a holy book. It is the oldest, most tested business manual in human history. And now you have one more page of it. Subscribe so you do not miss next week.